I'm going to introduce you and then I'll use it.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to, let's start the session. I'm not talking on this mic to you, but to the. So I wanted to say, we're so fortunate to have in our congregation. And one of the things, if you ever have a chance to talk to him, is to ask him about his debate history. You know, he was a national debater, not just minor league, but major league. And so he's continued to support us from the standpoint of education for many, many years, probably 15 or 16. And so we're delighted to have him today to talk about this very complex thing. Thank you, Tom.
Mike? No? In politics since I was very, very young. I still remember when John Kennedy was killed, I was in 3rd grade. And I remember walking home from school when they let us out early. I remember walking home and looking up for the contrails, because I was already thinking that we were going to war. I was in 3rd grade. And I've had this interest in international relations ever since that time. And then in 1974 and 1975, I spent a year in Florence, Italy, in the Gonzaga and Florence program, and I allowed my year over there to put an accent on international relations. And while I was there, I applied for a grant out of a New York foundation to write my senior thesis, and was awarded enough to afford me an opportunity to spend several weeks in Brussels, Belgium, and Strasbourg, France, which were the 2 headquarters of the emerging European Economic Community, or EEC. And I had decided that I wanted to write my thesis where I proposed an integration of the economies of the United States and the emerging. That was my senior thesis. When I got back and I went to law school, I got excited about the international, which I applied for and was accepted. For school. For the last 14 years, I've taught American politics at Gonzaga, so I shifted over to domestic politics from international politics. And when the opportunity to talk about the preeminent large issue of our day and as far as international relations was concerned came up, I jumped at the opportunity to have a chance to talk to you about it. So before I start, let me give you just a very brief history to set some context for this dispute that we're having between Russia and Ukraine, because it goes back a very, very long way. If anybody is familiar at all with the history of Europe, it is the history of warfare. And as a consequence of that, there had to be a way that we could change the way these countries dealt with each other in order to avoid the concurrent wars and all of those things that were interfering with their ability to have peaceful nation states. And it's a little Van Gogh-esque in its appearance, so I apologize for that. But what I wanted to do with this was to first talk about here, and I'm leaving out these countries here. I'm just talking about these countries here. They were at war all the time. Over the last 100-year war, the War of the Roses, the Norman Conquest, it's just one time after another that they have invaded each other. what can we do that will operate to put this war-making proposition that has consumed behind us so that we can begin to do some other things with our money and our time and our talent and our skills? And they decided that they would create a union, and they would call it the European Economic Community, the EEC, which was what was developing at the time that I was studying in Europe, which was also very nice because I was fortunate enough to be able to be at the front end of the developing United States of Europe. And I was able to have enough money from this grant to be able to go up to Brussels and to Strasbourg to talk to the diplomats and to do my research on, and put it together as they were beginning to develop this and to actually have a vision of what they wanted to do. It's not exactly the same today as what they wanted, but it's pretty close. We'll talk about that. The other thing to remember is that when we go to this part of the map, over to this side of the map, we have a very different. In the eastern part of the world, there is not any kind of significant to governing in the East. And as a consequence, there's not really any experience in that part of the world when it comes to any kind of governing models that they want to use. So then we go to World War II, and after World War II was over, the Russians had essentially come at Germany from the east. The United States and England came at Germany from the south and from over this direction, the west. And so when the Russians came across Ukraine and Belarus and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and Poland and Hungary and Romania, when they came over here to Hitler's Germany, once they had defeated Hitler, the presumption was that they would then once again release these little, that they could go forward. Soviet Union chose not to do that. Instead, they chose to keep all of these little countries into what came to be known as satellite orbit of the larger Soviet Union. And they had no independence. Their resources, the beck and call of the Soviet Union. Their kids had to serve in the Soviet military. They were essentially absorbed into the growing Soviet Union. And at that time, the Soviet Union was set on world domination. And they made it very, very apparent to the rest of the world that that was going to be their goal. So that comes along, and Germany is defeated. These countries, once again, are released, but they go over to the Soviet Union. They don't actually get their independence back. That doesn't happen until the 1990s. Imploded. They have not been able to sustain their ability to have this huge empire that they had created. They didn't have the money for it. They no longer had the loyalty of those various countries. And they essentially, under Mikhail Gorbachev, essentially let all of these countries go and allowed them to have their independence back. And so all of these countries then sought their independence and once again became their own independent nation states. Well, then the question was, well, what do they do now? Okay, they're ruined because of the war. They're small, so they're really at the beck and call of the great powers around them. They've just been crushed in World War II. What do they do? So they began to think, how do we protect ourselves from this continuing onslaught from our larger neighbors, militarily and economically? So militarily, they decided, we're going to join the Western Alliance to protect ourselves. And that Western Alliance is called NATO. We are also going to allow ourselves to become more fully integrated into the societies and the economies of Western Europe as opposed to the Soviet Union. And so after World War II, you begin to see a migration of these countries away from the orbit of the Soviet Union and to a point where they begin to embrace the West. And they began to look towards the West as their new governing model for their democracies. And they create all of these democracies along that various stretch of area. So then how did we get here today? The NATO organization was put together at the end of World War II to combat and to be insulation against the expansion of Soviet. So we'll talk about that in a minute and see how that becomes important to us. So then how did we get here today with Ukraine? How do we find ourselves in a war situation once again on a continent that had made the name of Viktor Yanukovych, rejected the deal for greater economic integration with the European Union. Now remember, the European Union is this collection of European states that have put themselves together in an organization called now the European Union, used to be the EEC, put themselves together, and they've decided that they're going to give a little piece of their individual sovereignty as a nation to an organization called the EU. And so the decision, for example, over what kind of trade policy we're going to have is no longer Romania's. It's no longer France's. It is the EU's decision as to how that's going to happen. So they've discovered that there is strength in numbers. And so they have taken little bits of their own sovereignty and they've given it to this organization called the EU. And they've said, you now make decisions that are for the benefit of the entire body politic, as opposed to just Romania or just France. That has also led to some of the friction, particularly in England, that led to them withdrawing from the EU. Because all of a sudden now they're being told what to do by their own capitals, plus they're being told what to do by a supranational organization that isn't even their country. It's something over their country. And England got tired of that. They got tired of being told what to do by Brussels. And as a consequence, they left the Union. And ultimately, I think it's going to be an incredible mistake for Great Britain. Anyway, in 2013, the EU had made overtures to Ukraine. Now, it's important because Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. It is the largest country in the Soviet Empire prior to the time that it dissolved. So this is a big deal. There's 40 to 45 million people that live in this country, so it's not a small nation. In 2003, they were invited to the EU. And essentially, Viktor Yanukovych, who was the president, said, I don't want to do that. We're not going to do that. He was aligned with Russia, and they were continuing to have their policies and so forth align more closely with the Russian policies than they were with those of Western Europe and the European Union. So now the people of Ukraine got pissed off. And they got in the streets and they started to say, no, we want to become part of Europe. We want to increase our standard of living and our security. As a consequence of those street protests, Yanukovych took his police force out and they started banging heads seriously. And there was a significant amount of violence visited upon those protesters by Yanukovych and the police in Ukraine. This caused the people of Ukraine to really get mad. And as a consequence, Yanukovych was forced to leave the country and he fled to Russia. He was in Russia for about a month before the Russians then turned around and invaded Ukraine. Not the current invasion, but the invasion that resulted in the loss of Crimea. Right down here. And this is the place on the Black Sea where the Russians originally came in and took it over. They took it over because there were Russian speakers in this area, as there are throughout this area. Most of the Slavic languages are shared here in many respects, but they took this Crimea essentially from Ukraine, and Ukraine wasn't strong enough to be able to keep them from doing that. So they had a sham election in Crimea, voted to join the Russian Federation. After that vote, Russia annexed Crimea as part of Russia, and then 2 months later, the pro-Russian separatists that we keep reading about in the paper and hearing on the news in Eastern Ukraine fell into a conflict now, an armed conflict with the military of Ukraine. So essentially now we're fighting an internal, almost essentially a civil war between the national government of Ukraine and the separatists that live down in this area here, which is called the Donbass. When they started fighting over there, of course, the Russians came in and supported the separatists. And of course, the Ukrainians were fighting their own battle. Armed conflict erupted. And then in April of 2016, because of that situation, NATO became concerned. And NATO then deployed 4 battalions to Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia to increase the security of those countries along this border here with Russia. When you look at Ukraine and Belarus, Ukraine, as a former Soviet satellite, is now looking to move over here. Belarus is virtually the only country left in these countries, with the exception of Albania and Georgia, that still has ties to the Soviet or to Russia. Okay, so this is the war that's being fought. The orange line here and the Western European influence. These countries here were given their independence after the close of World War II. Instead of staying with the Russians, they moved over to the Western Europeans, which essentially gave them the military security that they needed to protect their countries from future military conflict. And it allowed them to integrate into a European community, which was now able to increase their standard of living and their economic condition. So that was a win-win for all of them. But what it did is when they joined NATO, it gave them the protections of NATO. Now, what's important about NATO is that NATO is based upon collective developments for security. If one nation is attacked, the entire NATO alignment comes in behind them. This happened in Afghanistan. When we were attacked and we went into Afghanistan to respond to the 9/11 attacks in the United States, NATO came in behind us because we had been attacked in the United States by these folks. That kicked in the provision of NATO, which was the self-defense provision, which is what led to the NATO countries then contributing troops to the Afghanistan experience that we had for 20 years. Okay? So NATO is now a military organization. If I could have the next slide, Mike, on NATO. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Its purpose is to guarantee the safety and freedom of its members by political and military means. Their decision-making is by consensus. They all have to agree. Now, this is important for what's happening right now, because you're looking at the very real possibility that Finland and Sweden, which had been historically neutral countries, Sweden for 200 years of neutrality, are now joining the EU and have applied. So I put the dotted line here to represent how far the Russian influence is going to go and then stop. So this is a possible extent continent from the Western part. That's what we got with NATO. It's always by consensus. The problem they're going to have with Sweden and Finland members is why that. Turkey's upset because Sweden and those Scandinavian countries have been supporting an organization that has been seeking independence from Turkey, the Kurds. Okay, so now the Turks are mad at the Finns and the Swedes for supporting the Kurds and are standing in the way as the only country standing in the way of those countries becoming part of NATO. Okay, so the suspicion is they are probably looking to get some concessions from NATO. I suspect that if we put enough money in their pocket, enough concessions to buy more stuff from their retailers and wholesalers, that will get them to is a who's who of European countries. Most new applicants are Finland and Sweden. Now, the trigger for defense is any attack on a member state. Now, this is important from this perspective. If the Soviet Union, if Russia was to attack one of those member states, Okay, clearly that is not in the have the wherewithal and the ability to be able to overcome a reaction fully by NATO. Now, we do see some response from NATO countries. We're sending untoward amounts of military equipment into Ukraine and billions and billions of dollars, all designed to fight the Russian army. But it's not putting NATO troops on the ground. It's not putting NATO air power over the country with a no-fly zone that would keep the Russians from being able to use the. NATO has essentially made the decision to support NATO as a conflict, which is a problem because we no longer have battlefields that are going to be conventional. We now have nuclear artillery shells that can be used on the battlefield. So this is not a time to be going to war. So when we look at NATO, this gives you a good idea of who they are. Now, after World War II was over and we began to immediately understand that Russia was not going to go along with the program that the West had set up for the end of the war, the West then had to protect themselves. So they set up NATO. To respond to that, the Soviet Union set up an organization called the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact consisted of all these countries that are now in NATO. Kind of an agreement that NATO is that if they were attacked by anybody from the West, everybody in the Eastern Alliance would then come to their support. So we had both the Warsaw Pact in the East and NATO in the West standing off and holding each other accountable, militarily speaking, in Europe. Well, in 1991, when the Soviet Union imploded and it became Russia and they lost all of these territories, they lost the Warsaw Pact as well, and it was disbanded at that point. So you can begin to see now with the loss of territory, the loss of influence, the Warsaw Pact, and the perception that the West is moving towards the East. Put it all together, add in a little paranoia, and you've got exactly what's going on in Russia today. You've got a man who believes that ultimately Russia is going to be invaded by the West. Not even close to what NATO is going to do or wants to do. They could not do that by consensus on their worst day, okay? But you put enough paranoia into that mix and that's what you're going to get as a response. So let me make sure I know where I am here. So when Ukraine made its overtures to join the EU in 2013, that sent a shockwave through the Russian leadership. Because Ukraine now, the largest former Soviet satellite country, was going to become part of the West. That's important because Ukraine is a really important country. It's one of the largest. Has access to the Black Sea. Now notice here, there's a huge contingent of Russian ships and Navy presence in the Black Sea. And the only way for Russia to get to the Black Sea because of this is through this little strait here. It's called the Bosporus Strait, the Dardanelles. And the Dardanelles and the Bosporus Straits are this little. And this is what allows the Russian fleet access to the larger Mediterranean and ultimately the Pacific. We're being hemmed in, okay? And if you're being hemmed in, and that is the way that he has reacted. Putin also comes at this as an old KGB guy. He was in the KGB, which was intelligence agencies of Russia at the time. He was not a particularly political person. But when Mikhail Gorbachev ended the Soviet Union and it became Russia, and then picked Putin out of the KGB and brought him into the political apparatus of Russia. And that was the beginning of the rise of Mr. Putin. Can I have the next slide, please? The EU, it's a political and economic union of 26 member states, primarily located in Europe. Its attempt is to promote peace and the value of its particular citizens. The original purpose was to bring peace to the European continent. And they have primarily succeeded in that. We have not had a lot of wars between Spain and France and Italy and all those countries ever since World War II. So they have succeeded in that. Their population is huge. It's 447 million. Now keep that into perspective. The United States is about 335 million people, and Russia is about 145 million people. So it's a very different place. This is a huge block of economic trade and economic potential. The European Parliament, it's designed much like the American system. They have different branches of government, but they're located in different places. But their major headquarters for their executive offices, for their president and so forth, is in Brussels, Belgium. So they've got three elements of their country's government, much like we have here in the United States, with certain checks and balances as well. Okay. The European Council consists of the presidents and prime ministers of all the EU countries, and they meet 4 times a year. There has to be an agreement by the president of the council with whatever is passed by the European Parliament as law or as legislation in the United States. And exist in the authoritarian model. Strategically located. It also has a great deal to do with what's available to both the Russians as well as to the Western Europeans. And the Russians are viewing the attempts by Ukraine to join the Western Europeans as an attempt to abandon Russia and essentially go a different way. And that's going to matter when you start talking about the EU. If I could have the slide on let's see, Ukraine. Yes. Form of government's a unitary multi-party republic with a single legislative house. Their official language is Ukrainian. There is some discussion by the Russian folks that their reason for being there is to protect Russian speakers, and that this is logically a Russian piece of territory because of the Slavic there. But the Slavic language that is being used in Ukraine exists in Russia, Ukraine, and virtually all of these other Slavic. Another country with your military. Their crops are important because 1/5 of the world's high-grade wheat comes right out of Ukraine, and 1/7 of the wheat in the world comes out of Ukraine. So when they're not providing exports of grain and other to the world like they have in the past, that's going to reduce the supply of those products to the international market. That's going to meet increased demand for them, which is going to increase the price. So as we're looking at white wheat here in the United States right now, our farmers are kicking their heels because they're going to have to their status. They're independent of their former Soviet satellite, and the trouble that they've got is caused by their overtures to NATO and the European Union. So as a consequence of that, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, what has happened? We've had, by best estimates, and the estimates go wildly from 1,000 people to 10,000 people killed, and they've settled on about 3,000 civilians have been killed so far. 7 million Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes. Another 5 million refugees have fled the country to neighboring countries. And the Russian army failed to take the capital of Kyiv, and as a consequence now is focusing all of its efforts on this section of the country here. And that's important because as far as Ukraine is concerned, this is their industrial. So if they at a later time. So there's a lot on the line. So as a result of this invasion, the United States and NATO levied significant economic sanctions on Russia. Can I have the slide on sanctions, Mike? Invasion and deter future aggressive behavior. It is not designed or intended to keep them from staying in Ukraine. It's not designed to keep them out of Ukraine. They're already in Ukraine, okay? This is to punish them for that fact and to create a disincentive for them to want to do it to Moldova, to any of the other organizations that belong to the Western Pact. What are these sanctions? They're financial penalties imposed by one or more countries on another to stop it acting aggressively or breaking international law. That's essentially what my thesis was going to be in my senior year of college. The idea that we would take the economies of the West and use them to leverage peace with the economies and the people of the East is still being used today as a way of trying to get some peace out of these folks. And so it's interesting to see how it has evolved from the 70s up to today. What are they targeting? They're targeting Russian banks, their oil and gas industry, and the financial assets of those individuals who are closest to Putin, as well as the industries that are vital to Russia's economy, as well as Putin and his family members. Now, this is important to understand. When we talk about Russian banks and what's being done, you've heard about the government saying that we've removed them from the SWIFT international banking system. The SWIFT international banking system is designed to allow banks to immediately communicate with each other and move money around, okay? They can't do that anymore. So you can immediately see the problem the Russians are going to have if they don't have an ability to readily move large amounts of money around, because they're no longer that situation. The oil and gas industry, the West has to be a little careful here, because while the United States is self-sufficient when it comes to energy, that is not the case for the Europeans. The Europeans on their oil and gas industry right now, because then to make up the shortfall. So as a consequence, NATO took the position now this is you could walk across that and not have to look both ways, because there weren't enough cars to be worried about. There were trucks and there were.
Yeah.
Hi, Mike. I noticed that the audio keeps coming in,
Moscow
coming
at
in
the
and out.
time, 4.5 million. Poor they were at providing the kinds of consumer goods that the rest of us really take for granted. So really, Russia, but for the fact that they have a nuclear weapon, would be an incredibly poor country, and very significant portions of it would actually be third world status. If you take them and look at their current condition as an economic power, they are about 13th or 14th. I think they're behind Italy in terms of the wealth. And so they've got a lot of things working against. They're really in trouble here because they don't have the technology to be able to pull it out of the ground the way the Western countries do. Most of the pulling out of the ground that's being done in Russia today by the Russian government is being done by Western companies that have their own technology and ability to access those underground fields. So now that the companies in the United States and the Western Europeans have pulled out, you're now seeing a rise in unemployment. You're seeing a rise in inflation. You're seeing a rise in a lack of confidence in the government in Russia. You're seeing the beginnings of what every authoritarian is afraid of, and that is its people. You do not piss off your people if you are an authoritarian. The sanctions are primarily financial in nature. We've chosen not to give Mr. Zelensky his no-fly zone because as soon as NATO starts shooting down Russian aircraft, we're going to have a direct war between NATO and the United States. So we've made the decision that while we won't do the no-fly zone, we will send them as many anti-aircraft and other weapons as they can possibly carry to try to equalize out the ability of the two sides to be able to maintain some competitiveness. And so that's what we've decided to do. We are now considering going much further on gas to a point of complete. Watching the paper, the United States and Europe are trying to find ways to increase their own productive capacity to make up for the shortfall that is going to come if they choose to themselves pull back the buying of those oil and gas resources from Russia. So we're going to see a lot of that coming up in the future, and it's a very delicate situation, and it's going to have economic consequences in the West. Some of what we are experiencing here in this country is a direct result of these sanctions that are being done. And we just have to kind of look at that and take the position that we all have to do some sacrificial giving. If this is important enough for us to do as a world, then we need to be sacrificial about doing it and doing it the right way. And that's kind of the way that I look at it. But what is happening in Ukraine, though, is a symptom of a larger problem between authoritarian governing models typified by countries like Russia, China, North Korea, even Belarus here is one of the last dictators in Russia or in the world. So what is happening is those two models, democratic approaches to governing and authoritarian approaches to governing, are clashing. And they're clashing especially over this Ukraine. And so the Ukrainians have said that from our perspective, we want to be part of a progressive West that has an ability to improve the condition of our people. We don't want to be a part of a failed state, essentially, that's not going to be able to provide that to us. Now, this struggle is really, really important to us for this reason. Human rights and freedoms are all at risk under authoritarian rule. Similarly, creativity and innovation tend to suffer from the harshness of authoritarian rule. When you look at China, for example, business in China, when you sign a contract to get important because the system does not work well in getting people to be innovative and creative. Authoritarian systems are not good for innovation and creativity. They just never have been. And a part of it is because you don't have that independence that the human spirit needs. You don't have that ability to improve yourself personally, and everything's done to you or for you. And so as a consequence, creativity and innovation suffer. And that is why these authoritarian systems require the Western countries to give some of that technology. It's one of the reasons why there's a huge a corporate theft of technology by the Chinese and the Russians, because they don't have the wherewithal to do it themselves, and so they have to take it from the West. So if we choose to finally end, they are in serious trouble. Main source of income for an already underdeveloped country, and that's going to be a problem. The appeal, though, of authoritarian systems is the fact that these governmental systems are more efficient and they're easier to put in place than democratic systems. Think about it. An authoritarian system, you've got only people you got to please is the couple at the top of the pyramid, right? And then they make the decisions and policies for everybody else and tell everybody else what to do, okay? That's a problem. That's the way authoritarians work, but it's very efficient. If you want to go and do something, you just tell them down that forest, you turn it all into lumber and you build a city there. And they do it, okay? They don't worry about the pollution it's going to cause. They don't worry about all the other things that we in the West worry about when we get our zoning codes in place and so forth. Democracy, on the other hand, is incredibly messy, okay? When you look at our own country, we need look no further than to see the failure of democratic rule. We cannot get anything done in this country. If you go to Congress today, you could not get those congressmen to agree at Sunday without them going and confirming it independently. Okay, it's messy, it's ugly, but on the other hand, it also preserves our individual freedoms and our rights and our ability to make our own personal decisions. And it preserves an ability on each of us to be able to have a say over what our government does or doesn't do. And ultimately, it gives us the ability to change our government theoretically if we choose we don't like them and we want to change them. So there's a real juxtaposition between the two governing theories that's going on in the world today. In democracies, governing is not only hard, but it's really ugly sometimes. And that is a strong inducement for third world countries that are now emerging. They're looking at what governing model do we want to use? Probably the best advertisement for the authoritarian model is the way we do democracy. Because those authoritarians go to those little countries and they say, look at that United States, the model of democratic rule. Look what's going on in their country. They get nothing done. They fight with each other. It's messy and ugly. You know, that, just have your military install somebody and you can just tell people what to do. And we don't have all the messiness that goes with that. That's very appealing to young countries that don't have any kind of a history with democratic rule or democratic institutions and so forth. So it's anyone's guess as to how this war is going to turn out. The Ukrainians have proven themselves to be very adept at defending their country. Given the weaponry that the Western countries have given them, I do not the Nazis that were running Ukraine, which was always interesting to me, given that Zelensky's a Jew. So it was always interesting to me how it was a Nazification, denazification attempt by the Russians. I'm still trying to figure that one out. And so essentially at this point, we've got a situation where we don't really know to say nothing of a powerful Russian Navy bombing them from the Black Sea. So I just don't see the Ukrainians being able to take that property back. At the same time, it's going to hurt the Ukrainians because this is their industrial base. Okay, now you can build industries elsewhere, which they will do, but this is going to hurt them in the short term because it's going to create a problem where essentially if this were the United States, we'd be taking and knocking off a portion of Washington and sending it away. Eastern Washington maybe would go to somewhere else and the West would stay with the rest of the country from the Cascades on. That's what's happening in Ukraine today. So what will actually happen, I don't really know for sure. The thing about international relations is that they can change on a dime. It's really interesting how quickly international relations can shift. When you look, for example, at what's going on in Sweden and Finland have had 200 years of military neutrality. And they have been just dogged about making sure that they did not cross that neutrality line. But here they are, applying for application to NATO now, simply because of the things that have been happening to Ukraine. This has got to be probably the biggest mistake that a national leader has ever made. To invade a country and not have an ability to win when you are one of the preeminent powers in the world. Come on, you got to wonder about that. And then his whole idea was, let's stop this. Let's keep this from happening. We don't want Ukraine to join that, and then move that line clear over here. Well, the problem is that you pissed off the Swedes and the Finns to the point that they said, we want in now. That the European NATO organization can't do anything without everybody on board. They felt that they could split NATO. They felt that there would be some countries of NATO that wouldn't want to do this and support Ukraine because they were so close to the border. They miscalculated. The West was able to keep that NATO alliance together and actually expand it to this point. Serious miscalculation in terms of how they expected this to ultimately end up. Any questions? Marty.
I just want to say that the Russian-Ukrainian situation is very complicated. A lot of Ukrainians, many of them have parents, one Russian, one Ukrainian. This is like a family feud going on there. Those shaded areas in the east are majority Russian speaking. A majority of those people consider themselves in Ukraine, but aligned with Russia.
About 60%.
Yeah, and it's very complicated. And when the Ukrainians voted for independence, they made a mistake because they immediately passed a law and it doesn't sound like it's out because there was too much corruption. So things are very complicated there. I'm not saying Putin isn't a very bad person. This is a terrible thing he's done. I'm just saying that and Russia, whose only warm weather port in the whole country is in Crimea.
Black Sea.
Give that up. That's their only access to year-round shipping.
Ultimately happen in any kind of a peace deal is that Ukraine's going to be required to give.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. And any politician in Ukraine from giving up an inch of
It's going to be tough.
Now, I want to see what happens 10 years down the road, because the Ukrainians
That's
are
right.
not going to give it up.
No, that's right.
Providing them with weapons, it's going to continue to bleed the Soviet Union, Russians. Now, here within the next couple of years, they will have completed the LNG terminals and the necessary pipelines for all of Europe to go
That's
on
right.
Russian gas and oil. So unless Russia is able to replace those sources with China or India, which seems unlikely, their economy is going to completely tank. They've already got a demographic problem.
That's
They're
right.
recently having a flight of their intellectual potential.
Brain drain.
Yeah, so this is not going to work out well for the long run. And I don't see the Ukrainians giving up that.
Not in the long run, but in the short run, that's the only way they're going to get peace.
But they're winning now. So
They are.
what's their incentive?
They are.
I mean,
There's no incentive right
we
now.
just wrote them a blank check of $40 billion. So they're looking at that going, we can keep this up indefinitely.
Yeah.
I mean, you don't attack a country of 44 million people with 100,000 troops.
No.
That's just stupid.
It is.
So,
Mhm.
my question, I'm showing my ignorance here, but say,
Shaken their confidence. To take 200 years of commitment to neutrality and to throw it over, you look at the polling in both countries. Before the war, you would never have gotten them to join. But since the war, the public opinion in those countries has said, hey, we're only countries of 8 or 9 million people. We wouldn't have a snowball's chance against these guys if they chose to attack us. And so they're sitting there going, what's the better thing for us to do to protect ourselves? And so I think that's going to be what really sits in the mind of the Swedes and the Norwegians more than anything else, or the Finns.
based on the fact that Finland shares the border with Russia.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Fought a long war with Russia.
Yeah.
During the winter in the Second World War, before and after, they were defeated by the Russians, gave up territory. They want protection.
Yep. They're very afraid now.
I wondered about NATO. You said that they all have to agree that it's a 30% of yea votes and no votes.
My understanding is that they have to all agree.
Everything.
Yeah. Yeah, they all have to agree. It's even like the Spokane Alliance. When we make our decisions at the Spokane Alliance, if there's one institutional member that's against the campaign, we don't do it. So it's the same kind of an approach that NATO takes. Now, they may work some deals with Turkey that overcome their objection, but I think they're going to have a special agreement, I think, if they're going to get it through.
I have two questions. One in the Donbass area, which you
Yeah.
So in my mind, if that's the case, giving that up doesn't make any difference. They're gonna have to spend the money to build those industries back. And they can build them wherever they feel it's the best.
Right, but they're not going to have the resource base that exists here that drew industry in the first
That was
place.
my-
Yeah.
that was what-
Yeah. I'm not real familiar with all of that. All I know is that that's what drew their industry there in the first place.
So second question, assuming that they know this area
Mhm.
and that it ultimately ends with Ukraine being exactly what Ukraine is now. What happens to the relationship between Russia and China? Can you look forward to that a little bit?
It's been really interesting. I was curious as to how China would mix this situation, and I've been pleased to see that they did what I had hoped they would do. They had a meeting with Putin right after the war started, and he came away and they said that they were all in accord and on top of it with each other. And I was worried that they would be able to offset some of the material that was coming in from the West and perhaps even help prop up financially the Russians, because their economy is taking a huge hit right now. And I have been pleased that they haven't seemed to have done that. I think that China is very well known for playing the long game. They are not going to be pulled into a local regional conflict very readily or easily because of that national focus on the long game. And so I think they're saying, okay, on the one hand, we'll give lip service to what Putin is doing. We may even do a few things to help his economy a little bit, but they're not going to be enough to save it. And on the other hand, they're not going to do that simply because they want the West to be their main competitor and they don't want to fight a two-front war. Why should we go and help out a country that frankly isn't going to win? And why should we run the risk that we're going to have the ire of the West focused on us in some respect because of what we're doing with the Russians? So I thought that they were concerned about, would the West then start pulling away from China in response to their response to this conflict?
So, following up a little bit, if Russia ultimately ends up losing, it's nothing, then where's their economic base? Doesn't that have to come from China?
Where else? But I honestly don't know an answer to that. I don't know what would ultimately happen. You got me there. I just don't know.
I can think of lots
Yeah.
of insight to that. Russia doesn't have much in the way of transportation networks from Russia down to China. Most of their transportation networks go east or west. So they really not a whole lot of used. Most of their transportation networks, rails, roads, pipelines, they all go into Europe. So to shift over into
back, if they were to
They want to be a part of NATO because once you've been attacked, I mean, why not again? Kind of thing is at the back of your mind. I think eventually they want to be in NATO, but I wouldn't be surprised if they had an agreement that they wouldn't apply for like 10 years or 15 years, something in the whatever settlement is proposed, which operates to keep them from doing that at least for a period of time, would be my guess.
So doesn't China need the West a lot more economically than it does Russia, and therein lies the peace in the hole or whatever.
Yep.
They, and also impacts Taiwan as their ability to do anything in that regard, having seen what happened to Russia.
And I think that's going to be a real pause for China if they had any thought of going into Taiwan militarily. I think they're rethinking that now because the West has made a huge military commitment to Taiwan. There's just no way they would sit back and let that island go. It's tough for China because China is the second largest economy in the world, and they are probably 4 or 5 years away from being the largest, with us second. So they're not going to want to mess that up. And I think they complicate their plans in the long run by deviating too much because of a local, fairly temporary regional dispute like we have with Ukraine and Russia. I just don't think that's going to.
nuclear weapon?
You know, that's a good question too. I don't. Western norms, they tend to be so outside what we think is appropriate that we begin to think of them as disabled or crazy in some respects. And I think we do ourselves a disservice if we land on crazy and stay there. The East looks at the world differently from the West. It's not any better or any worse, but they look at it differently. And I think we need to look at the Russians not as crazy, or him as crazy, as much as committed to a different worldview than the rest of us. I mean, where he can see a clearly defensive organization like NATO as an offensive threat already tells you that he's not crazy, but he's thinking in ways that we know that's not what it is. It's creep over towards their country with the continued belligerence of the West towards the East. And you add 1 and 1 still equals 2 in their mind. And for them, 2 is just a different 2 than for us. Yeah.
Following up on the worst case scenario approach to this, I think anytime that The other question I have is, why wouldn't Russia at this point take that southern tip of Ukraine completely, cutting Ukraine off from any access to the Black Sea?
I don't know. They could. They may still. You know, things could change very dramatically. It doesn't take much to change these kinds of things, especially when you got all this money and weaponry and people. There's so little. There's more chaos than order in Ukraine right now. And anytime there's a situation like that, it's really a guessing game of what happens. I think nuclear weapons, especially these new artillery shells that they're using on the battlefield that are nuclear, I don't think those will be. Too far. That would be a bridge too far for the Russians.
Now, how about one more question?
Okay, Jerry.
I like to point out that Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe.
Yep.
And that red sheeted area is a real problem for Ukraine. That's the port. They have to export that grain through those ports. And if they can't do that, they're in deep trouble.
Yep, that's exactly right. They'd have to work out some other arrangement with Moldova and Romania. They'd have to do something to get in there. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Questions?
Last I heard.